I'm confident that each one of us can remember times in our school years where we experienced trauma, depression, disappointment, or what we thought at the time was failure that would irreparably doom our futures. It's not hard to identify a student who's going through such a period at those times. It is important to non-judgmentally inquire and provide guidance to help him or her move through these times. David, who led a federal expert panel that identified these sounds and how to respond to them, will help us to understand how. David?
Thank you very, very much. I also want to thank Lauren and Ron. You don't think I'm on? Okay, I think I am on, okay? I'll just talk louder, okay? I would like to thank Lauren and Ron. In work that I've done in mental health and in climate, as well as in the early warning signs, over the past 20, 30 years, I've learned more always from young people than anybody else. And in a book that I have coming out next year that was written before the events, I talked about the most undertapped resources in our schools are our young people. But I've learned so much more in the last few weeks, but also have been learning from Black Lives Matter and the young people who have been really talking about these issues and helping us understand much more. And so I'm keeping with my slides, but I just added a few because I've already learned from you, Lauren. Okay, so on the one hand, schools are first slide, thank you very much, Sean, okay. Schools are a relatively safe place, and they're well positioned to reduce the likelihood of aggression and violence. But schools are contained places. What Lauren is talking about is actually possible. We can make schools safe. And as I'll talk in a minute, it's not just physically safe, it's emotionally safe, it's identity safe. That does require, as you've heard from both Ron and Lauren, access to social and emotional learning and mental health supports. And as we talk right now, it also, and make choices, it's how we allocate resources. There may be some places where one needs to invest some money in security personnel, but oftentimes that's at the expense of another counselor, of another mental health person, of a prevention intervention. And it's very important to understand that these things are connected. So schools can be made safer by developing a capacity to reduce the likelihood of aggression and violence while addressing student and staff needs for emotional, physical, and identity safety. And what we know is the fact that there are early warning signs which, understood in context, can signal that a child or youth is troubled and needs support. I had the privilege in 1998 in response to race shootings that are not really much different from right now, other than the fact that the weaponry is much more sophisticated, and there are lots of other things like the fact that people can experience these horrible events in real time and be further traumatized. The government pulled together an expert panel to really try to identify what are warning signs. And the work we did there is not very different from work Dewey has done with the APA and things like that, and at some point this work ought to be updated. But what we know now is enough to actually, as Lauren said, head off these problems. And we're particularly able to do it, and I'll talk about this, when we're in the type of caring, supportive environment that Ron's been talking about. These early warning signs must be assessed and addressed in a culturally and a developmentally appropriate manner, and in a way that minimizes harms and maximizes benefits. Because any time you intervene, you also have a risk of harm. Next slide, please. So safety. Oftentimes we think about physical safety and we think about that moment. But if I think about Valentine's Day, and I think about your class beforehand, I also think about, when do you feel emotionally safe? And if I think about someone who's experienced trauma in his life, when do people feel psychologically safe? And if someone is different in any way, when do they feel identity safe? And if we go to Black Lives Matter and what young people are talking about, when do you feel that you're being treated in a fair and equitable manner? And when are you safe from not just short-term problems, but long-term problems, perhaps health problems, that can happen when the cafeteria is unsafe, or you're afraid to go to the washroom? Next slide, please. If we want to use warning signs, and I think we can, schools need to develop the capacity to identify, to assess, and to respond to warning signs in a manner that reduces the incidence of problems, the amplification, making them louder and bigger of problems, and the impact of those problems. You know, in Lauren's class in school, I think the connections that you talked about, what we know, are also supportive. I mean, as horrific as everything you have, and I can only guess, what we know from science is that when you have a parent, when you have friends, I'm going to speed up, then that just buffers the effect of horrific things. And so we want to avoid them, but we also want to have those supports. And as I said, this can be best done in a caring manner that actually, to go to the next slide, has 3 tiers. It's what we do universally for everybody. It's the care that Ron was talking about. It's social emotional learning for everybody. It's support for teachers and for good, robust, equitable instruction. And then what we do for people who are at some level of need. And warning signs can help us if we do it right. And if students know about that, that can help us as well, because often they see their friends in ways that other people don't see. But they have to trust adults if that's going to happen, as well as know what happens. And then at the same time, there are some people who are at higher levels of risk who actually need much more intensive interventions. And there are some people, and Dewey will talk about it after me, who are exhibiting behaviors that really require immediate threat assessments or suicide assessments, because we cannot wait no matter what. And what I would just want to add quickly, that what we also know is that if you do these things, you don't only make schools safer, you also do things where you make schools more academically productive. And you also help people become more healthy in the long run. And my research is very consistent with Ron's in terms of that fact. And it's, again, longitudinal. It's in rural China as well as in the US, and we see the same things. These things are not a trade-off. The more safe young people feel in class, the more safe teachers are, the more people can handle these issues, the more able they are to engage in deeper learning, and the more likely they're able to attend schools. But when we do this, and when we use warning signs, we have to make sure we minimize unintended consequences. For example, suspension and expulsion, removing people, punishing people, the criminalization of things, and there's an error here in terms of my slide. We're on the next slide anyway, so I'm sorry, okay. And I see an error there. The criminalization of behavior rather than providing people with the services that they need. These behaviors can create what, in '98, we learned from both adults and students, conspiracies of silence, the language was. Why should I tell adults something when I know something, when I can't trust them to do something in a responsible way? And at the same time, it wastes resources, doing things that could be handled preventively and providing more resources for counselors. Next slide, please. Okay, so quickly, what are these warning signs? And remember here, any one sign at any one moment is nothing more than a signal. You're looking at someone who, through his life, has exhibited warning signs. It's the things together. But excessive feelings of isolation and being alone, excessive feelings of rejection, being a victim of violence, feeling picked on and persecuted, low school interest and poor academic performance, and changes that lead to this, the expression of violence in writing and drawings, uncontrolled anger, a history of discipline problems, patterns of impulsive and chronic hitting, intimidating, bullying behaviors, a history of violent and aggressive behavior, intolerance of differences and prejudicial attitudes, the use of drugs and alcohol, affiliation with gangs, the inappropriate access to and possession of abusive firearms, serious threats of violence, which are also an imminent warning sign. These are not just my list, and it goes to the expert panel. Oh, next slide, please. Alone, all they are signals. If we want to do them right, we have to do them in a way that makes sure that we don't do harm, that we don't stigmatize, that we understand what we're seeing within the context, including the fact that these may be set up by behaviors on the part of the school, and schools have their own warning signs. We need to avoid stereotypes and control for the effects of implicit bias. We have to understand that students, typically exhibit multiple warning signs and no one sign alone is sufficient. We need to assess before acting, and that requires some mental health expertise. We don't want to use the signs as a checklist. And we don't want to confuse early warning signs with imminent warning signs or signs that really require immediate action. But the early warning signs are to provide students with help. Next slide, please. So principles, no, we did that already, I think. All right, yes, okay, so I think we can go to the next slide. Please, yeah, okay. So let's now think about where we can intervene if there's signs. Okay. I think no matter what, a place to intervene is the student. We want to build her or his social and emotional skills. If the student has an anger problem, we want to equip them with the skills to deal with that anger. And the more, what we now know is that people's social, emotional, and cognitive skills are so inextricably interrelated. And so doing work in that area in one area helps things in other areas like academics. At the same time, what we also know is that who I am is not just a product of myself, it's also the people around me, the experiences I have. So it may be we need to intervene in my classroom, with my teacher, with my friends, and with my family. And remember, interventions ought to be supportive, not harmful. We also need to think about the entire school environment, what Ron's talked about. And as we'll hear, I think, in other places later on from Daniel, among others, is we have to think about societal factors. The access to guns in our society, the messages that people receive in our society really do matter. And last slide, please, which is the next slide. No, that was the last slide, okay. Let me end by saying we have decades now of research, and we have decades of successful federal interventions, which when implemented with quality and when implemented at scale actually make a difference. Examples, authorized by Congress were the Safe School, Healthy Student grantees, local and then state. And I have an infographic that was just produced regarding their impacts that I'm happy to share with people. Examples are the Safe and Supportive School grants that went to 11 states across the country to use climate to try to improve outcomes. And the local evaluations that were done of each of the 11 states showed that in all cases when people were intentional in the types of ways that Ron were talking about, that they did things like improve attendance in some states, improve academics in others, reduce incidences that made people feel unsafe in others. So this is not just trying to do new things. I think just as in the case of the warning signs, we have the accumulation of work that really provides us with messages which really suggest and indicate that we can make our society and schools safer, and that doing that really requires that three-tiered model that I talked about. It requires coordination of people within those three tiers. It involves actively listening to and using the voices of young people. It requires being culturally competent and culturally responsive. And it requires a vision that we really got from Lauren in terms of her aspirations. What every one of our children and youth in our society deserve is a school where they can be expanded, where they can develop collective resilience, not just individual resilience, which is where they can thrive together and learn together with equity. Thank you very much.